The summer sun sank low in the sky, painting the lake with colors of gold and red. The air carried the soft hum of cicadas, the laughter of children splashing in the pool, and the chatter of families enjoying the warm evening. Neighbors leaned back in chairs, sipping drinks and sharing quiet stories while their children swam and played. It felt like a perfect evening, the kind that stayed in memory as peace and happiness blended with the sound of water. The pool was alive with joy, a place for everyone, a simple escape from the long day. At the edge of this calm sat the man, quiet as always, his eyes calm and thoughtful, watching the scene with the faintest of smiles. He didn't speak much, but everyone noticed how his presence made the place feel safe. The harmony lasted until the sharp sound of heels striking against the pavement broke through the laughter. Heads turned, whispers spread, and the once light air grew heavy. Karen, the feared HOA president, was marching toward the pool gate, her face flushed with anger, her eyes narrowed like sharp blades. Her very posture carried authority she had forced on the valley for years. People froze as they always did when she appeared, their laughter cut short, their movements stiffening as though they were guilty of something. Parents pulled their children closer, some even whispered warnings to stay quiet. Everyone knew Karen's temper. Everyone knew she didn't come to share in the evening peace, she came to end it. Karen's eyes landed immediately on the man sitting quietly near the water. Her jaw tightened, her fury spilling into her voice. "What do you think you're doing here?" she snapped, her words slicing through the air. "This pool is not for anyone who refuses HOA permission. No one uses it without my approval." She grabbed the gate and slammed it open, storming inside like she owned not just the pool but the water, the ground, and the air itself. The man looked at her calmly, his face unreadable, his eyes holding steady as though he had expected this moment all along. He didn't rise. He didn't flinch. He simply watched her rage unfold, his silence carrying more weight than her shouting. Children stopped splashing, their laughter cut short, their eyes wide as they clung to the edge of the pool. Parents lowered their heads, unwilling to speak against her but unwilling to leave either. Whispers spread from neighbor to neighbor, nervous and uncertain. Karen thrived on that silence, on that fear. She had built her power on it, and tonight she meant to remind everyone of who she was. She raised her voice louder, shouting so that every neighbor could hear. "This pool is under HOA control. That means I decide who uses it, when it opens, and who is allowed inside. Anyone who refuses the rules will be fined. Anyone who refuses to pay will be removed. And you," she pointed a sharp finger at the man, her voice trembling with rage. "You think you're special because you sit there quietly, acting untouchable. But tonight, you'll learn that no one resists me." The neighbors shifted uncomfortably. Some looked at the man, curious about how he would respond. Others turned away, too afraid to meet his eyes, afraid of being caught in Karen's wrath. But the man remained still. His silence stretched long enough that the crowd grew restless, the children clutched closer, and even Karen faltered for a second, uncertain why he hadn't spoken. Finally, he stood, slowly, deliberately. His calm presence seemed to fill the space between them. He met her furious eyes with steady ones and said only one thing: "Not everything here belongs to you." The words were simple, but they cracked through the evening air like a hammer striking stone. Neighbors gasped softly, whispering nervously among themselves. No one had spoken to Karen like that before, not in public, not in front of so many witnesses. Her face flushed deeper, her mouth opening and closing as if she was searching for words sharp enough to cut him down. She stepped closer, her heels clicking angrily against the concrete. "Everything here belongs to the HOA, she hissed. "The pool, the docks, the clubhouse, even the way you paint your shutters. Every inch of this community follows my rules, and I will not have anyone breaking them. Do you understand me?" She turned to the neighbors, her voice rising, sharp and commanding. "If I let him sit here and ignore the rules, then what happens next? Chaos. Disorder. We will lose everything we built. Is that what you want?" The crowd was silent. No one dared to answer. They looked down, looked away, anything to avoid the weight of her glare. But the silence was different this time. It was not fear alone. It was curiosity, uncertainty, even doubt. Because the man still stood calm, his eyes unshaken, and something about his steady voice had struck a chord in their hearts. Karen turned back to him, her lips curling into a cruel smile. If you think you can defy me, then you'll regret it. I'll have you fined, I'll have you banned, I'll have you dragged out of here if I must. She pulled out her phone and waved it for everyone to see. If you don't leave right now, I'll call the police. And when they come, we'll see how long you last standing against me. She pressed the phone to her ear, her eyes locked on his, expecting him to falter, expecting him to beg. But he didn't. He only folded his hands behind his back, his expression calm, his eyes steady. The faintest smile touched his lips, as though he had been waiting for this moment, as though he already knew how it would end. He spoke again, his voice quiet but clear. Call them. The neighbors gasped louder this time. Parents pulled their children out of the pool, clutching them close as the tension tightened. Karen blinked, startled for a brief second, then quickly regained her fury. She turned away, shouting into the phone, her voice shrill and echoing across the water. Hello? Yes. I need officers here immediately. There's a man trespassing, refusing to follow HOA law. He's threatening the peace of the community. She shot the man a triumphant glance, expecting him to shrink under her call. But he remained calm. He lowered himself back into his chair, folding his hands in his lap as though the evening had never been disturbed. The neighbors couldn't take their eyes off him. Some felt fear for him, others felt awe. None of them could explain the quiet strength he carried, the way he stood so firmly without raising his voice. Children peeked from behind their parents' legs, their wide eyes fixed on the man who had done what none of them ever dared. He had told Karen no. The air grew thick with waiting. The sound of distant sirens began to rise, faint but drawing closer. Karen's face twisted into a smile of victory, her eyes gleaming as she turned to the neighbors. You see? Order will win. Fear will keep you safe. He will learn like the rest of you. But even as she spoke, something in her voice trembled. For the first time, the neighbors noticed it. And for the first time, they began to wonder, what if she was wrong? The man sat silently, his calm eyes fixed on the road where the sirens drew nearer, and for reasons they couldn't explain, the neighbors felt hope stir quietly in their hearts. The sound of sirens grew louder as red and blue lights flickered across the darkening road. Neighbors pressed closer to the fences and porches, their whispers sharp with tension. Children were hushed by their parents, pulled back from the pool as the police cars rolled up slowly, gravel crunching beneath their tires. Karen stood proudly near the gate, her hands on her hips, her face lit with the confidence of someone who believed victory was already hers. She waved eagerly at the approaching officers, calling out before they even stepped out of the vehicles. Over here. Officers. Right here. This man is refusing HOA authority. He's trespassing, breaking community law, and disturbing the peace. Her voice carried across the water, filled with the certainty that this moment would cement her power forever. Two officers stepped out, their expressions calm but serious. They glanced at the neighbors huddled together, then at the man who sat silently near the pool, his hands folded neatly in his lap. His calm demeanor was a stark contrast to Karen's sharp voice and furious gestures. The lead officer approached her first, holding up a hand to quiet her. Slow down. What exactly is the problem? Karen launched into a tirade, waving the stack of HOA papers in her hand. The problem is clear. He has no right to be here. He refuses to join the HOA, he refuses to pay fees, and now he's using the pool without permission. I demand that you remove him immediately. The officer listened, his brow furrowed, then turned to the man. Sir, do you have anything to say about this complaint? All eyes shifted to him. He rose slowly from his chair, his movements calm and deliberate. He did not shout, he did not argue. He simply reached for the leather folder resting beside him. The neighbors leaned forward, holding their breath as he opened it and handed the documents to the officer. His voice was steady, almost quiet, but every word carried. I am not trespassing. This pool, this land, This ground we stand on, it belongs to me. The officer flipped through the pages carefully, his partner leaning in to examine the seals and signatures. Their expressions shifted from neutrality to surprise, then to something heavier, respect. The papers bore seals older than the HOA itself, deeds signed and recorded long before Karen's rules existed. The officer looked up, his voice firm. These are official property deeds. They are valid. Gasps swept through the neighbors. Some covered their mouths, others clutched at each other in disbelief. Karen's face turned red with rage. She lunged forward, snatching at the papers. No! Those are fake. He made them up. He's lying to you, lying to all of you. But the officer pulled the documents back sharply, his tone stern. I've seen forgeries. These are not forged. These are legitimate. The neighbors began whispering louder now, their fear cracking into something new, hope. He owns the pool, one muttered. All this time, another whispered. Children peeked from behind their parents, their wide eyes reflecting something they had never seen before, Karen's power breaking. The man turned slowly to face the neighbors. His voice was calm, measured, but it carried across the gathering like a steady drumbeat. For years, you've been told you live at her mercy. That every step, every choice, every joy must first pass through her permission. But tonight you've seen the truth. She does not own this pool. She does not own this land. Fear is not law. Fear is only noise. His words lingered in the air, striking deep into hearts that had long been silent. Karen's voice cracked as she tried to shout over him. Don't listen to him. He's tricking you. Without me, there will be chaos. Without me, this community will fall apart. You need me. She pointed at the neighbors, her hands trembling. Tell him you need me. But the neighbors did not answer. Their silence was no longer fear, it was rejection. Their eyes, once lowered, now met hers without trembling. The officer folded the documents carefully and handed them back to the man. His voice was firm. If you want to challenge ownership, you'll have to do it in court. But tonight, he has every right to be here. There will be no arrest. He turned to the man with a respectful nod. Sir, you're within your rights. The poolside erupted with murmurs, some neighbors clapping softly, others whispering prayers of thanks. Karen stood frozen, her face pale with shock, her mouth open but no words coming. The power she had wielded for so long had slipped through her fingers, and everyone had seen it happen. The man placed the folder back under his arm and returned to his chair, his calm eyes scanning the crowd. Fear always shouts the loudest before it falls silent, he said simply. The neighbors felt the truth in his words. For the first time, they looked at Karen not as a ruler, but as a woman standing alone, exposed, her power shattered by a truth she could not silence. Karen stumbled backward, gathering her papers with trembling hands. This isn't over, she hissed, her voice shrill but empty. She stormed off toward the clubhouse, her heels striking the pavement, but her steps no longer carried authority, they carried desperation. The neighbors stayed behind, their eyes on the man by the pool. Whispers turned into quiet cheers, then louder ones. Some clapped, others raised their lanterns high, their glow reflecting on the water. That night, the valley didn't whisper in fear. It whispered in hope. And for the first time in years, the sound of children's laughter returned to the pool, louder than Karen's voice had ever been. The night after the police left, the valley was buzzing like never before. Families sat outside their cabins, lanterns glowing on porches, their voices carrying across the lake. For years, conversations had been quiet, whispers spoken behind closed doors, always afraid of who might be listening. But now the whispers grew bold, louder with every retelling of what had happened at the pool. Children repeated the story in excited tones, acting out the moment when the man had stood calm while Karen shouted. Parents spoke of the folder, of the officers admitting the truth, of the power in his quiet words. For the first time, the people of the valley were not talking about fines and threats, they were talking about hope. But at the clubhouse on the hill, the mood was far darker. Karen paced the length of her office, her red jacket tossed over a chair, her hair disheveled, her papers scattered across the desk like broken weapons. Her lawyer sat nearby, nervously adjusting his glasses, his face pale under the harsh light. "You need to calm down," he muttered. Karen spun on him, her eyes blazing. "Calm down? Do you understand what happened? They saw him stand against me. They saw those papers. And now they're whispering. No, they're doubting me. If they stop fearing me, I lose everything." She slammed her fist on the desk, her voice cracking. "I built this HOA. I made it powerful. I won't let some quiet man with old papers take it all away." Her lawyer hesitated, then said softly, "The documents looked real, Karen. If he truly owns the land, if he truly has those deeds." She cut him off with a furious shout. "He doesn't. He can't. And if he does, then I'll bury him in lawsuits before anyone can believe him. If the police won't drag him out, then the court will." She grabbed a fresh stack of forms, her pen scratching furiously as she wrote. "Tomorrow, I file. Trespassing. Fraud. Illegal use of property. I'll make the judge see him as a liar before he can even open his mouth." Her lawyer swallowed hard but said nothing. He knew better than to argue when Karen's pride was wounded. The next morning, rumors spread quickly. Karen had gone to the courthouse at dawn, storming inside with papers clutched in her hands, her voice sharp enough to be heard even from the street. Neighbors gathered in small groups, sharing the news. Some were afraid again. Court was serious, and Karen was dangerous when cornered. But others shook their heads, their courage still glowing from the night before. "She's desperate," one man muttered. "You saw her face when the police admitted the truth. She's losing her grip." Another added, "He won't stand alone this time. We'll be there." At the cabin, the man sat on his porch as the sun rose over the water, the leather folder resting on the table beside him. His wife joined him, her face calm but her eyes searching his. "She's taking it to court," she whispered. He nodded slowly, as though he had been waiting for this moment all along. "Fear always returns for one last fight," he said. "But truth is patient. Truth does not break." His children came running out, unaware of the storm brewing, their laughter light and free. He smiled faintly at them, his calm eyes steady. By evening, the valley gathered again, but this time not at the pool. They gathered near the courthouse steps, lanterns in their hands, their voices low but determined. They had heard the stories, seen the change, and felt something stronger than fear rising in their hearts. One by one, they began to speak of their own struggles. An old woman confessed how Karen fined her for the color of her curtains. A father described how she destroyed his son's treehouse. A mother broke down as she spoke of her garden being torn out. Each story was like a stone added to a wall, building strength where there had only been silence before. The man stood among them, quiet, listening, his presence steady as stone. When the crowd fell silent, he finally spoke. "Tomorrow we face her in court. She will shout. She will wave her papers. She will call you weak and foolish. But remember this, fear cannot erase truth. You lived under her shadow for years, but shadows vanish when the light shines. Tomorrow, the light shines in the courtroom." His words spread through the crowd like fire, and the neighbors raised their lanterns high, their flames flickering against the dark sky. Meanwhile, in the clubhouse, Karen prepared like a general before battle. She stacked her papers high, rehearsed her speeches in front of a mirror, her voice rising with each declaration. "He is a fraud. He is a trespasser. He is nothing." But as the night wore on, her voice cracked, her hands trembled, and her reflection stared back at her with doubt. She turned away sharply, clutching her papers tighter. "They'll see," she whispered to herself. "They'll all see tomorrow." The valley slept lightly that night, hearts heavy with expectation, lanterns still glowing in windows as if to ward off fear. The courthouse loomed in the distance, its doors closed but waiting. And when morning came, the people would walk through those doors together, not as silent, fearful neighbors, but as a community ready to face the truth. The morning of the hearing arrived heavy with tension, the kind of morning where the air itself seemed to wait for something to break. The courthouse, An old stone building that had seen decades of arguments and verdicts stood tall against the rising sun. Its steps were already crowded long before the doors opened. Neighbors filled the street, their lanterns glowing even in daylight, their voices hushed but steady. Reporters pressed through the crowd, microphones raised, cameras flashing, sensing that this was more than a local dispute. It was the collapse of a reign built on fear. Inside, the benches filled quickly. Families who once trembled in silence now sat shoulder to shoulder, their faces nervous but determined. Some clutched papers of their own, fines and warnings they had saved as proof of years of oppression. Others brought only their voices, ready to be heard at last. The air buzzed with whispers until the sound of sharp heels echoed down the aisle. Karen entered with her lawyer at her side, her chin high, her red jacket pressed sharp against her frame. She carried a thick stack of papers, slamming them onto the defense table with a flourish meant to remind everyone of her authority. Her smile was tight, almost brittle, but she held it as if it were her armor. The man entered quietly soon after, his wife at his side, the leather folder tucked neatly under his arm. He did not stride with arrogance nor shrink with fear. He walked with the same steady calm that had carried him through every storm, his presence filling the room without a single word. Neighbors leaned forward to watch him, some nodding faintly, others whispering encouragement. He nodded once in return, acknowledging their faith, before taking his seat at the front. The judge entered, the gavel in hand, his robe flowing as he took his seat at the bench. Silence fell like a blanket over the room. His stern eyes scanned both sides before striking the gavel once. This court is now in session. We are here to determine rightful ownership of the pool and the surrounding land, and to examine the actions of the homeowners association. His voice echoed off the high ceiling, final and commanding. Karen's lawyer was the first to rise. His voice was sharp, practiced, and loud enough to carry to the farthest corner. He painted a picture of order and discipline, of rules that protected the community. He held up bylaws, inspection reports, photographs of homes, and waved them like banners of truth. This man, he said, pointing sharply toward the calm figure across the aisle, is nothing more than a trespasser who refuses the order that keeps this valley safe. He defies the HOA, rejects its authority, and spreads lies about his so-called ownership. Without the HOA, chaos would reign. Without this president, the valley would fall apart. Karen nodded eagerly, her eyes glinting, her smile tightening as though victory were already in her grasp. But the Attorney General rose next, his voice calm but deep, carrying with a weight that silenced the room. He walked slowly to the judge's bench, the leather folder in his hands. "Your Honor," he said firmly, "order does not come from fear. It comes from truth. And today, the truth lies in these documents." He opened the folder, laying the deeds on the bench for the judge to see. These are original property records, sealed and recorded decades before this HOA existed. They prove that the pool and the land surrounding it are not, and never were, under HOA authority. They belong to the family of this man. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Neighbors leaned forward, eyes wide, whispering in disbelief. The judge examined the pages carefully, his brow furrowing as he traced seals pressed deep into thick parchment, maps marked with careful ink, signatures scrawled in fading handwriting. Slowly, he nodded, his expression grave. Karen's face paled, her smile faltering. She shot to her feet, her voice shrill and desperate. "Lies! Old scraps of paper mean nothing here. The HOA is the law. I am the law. Without me, they'd destroy themselves. Without me, none of this would exist." She turned toward the neighbors, her voice rising in panic. Tell him you need me." But the benches remained silent. Dozens of faces stared back at her, not with fear but with cold, heavy truth. The judge struck the gavel sharply. Sit down. This court will not be shouted into submission." His voice cut through the air, final. One by one, neighbors began to rise. An elderly man stood first, his cane shaking but his voice strong. "She fined me for my shutters, Your Honor. 3 times, though I painted them as she asked." A mother rose, tears glistening in her eyes. She tore my garden out of the ground. Roses from my grandmother. She said they weren't approved. A father followed, his hand resting on his son's shoulder. She destroyed my boy's swing set. He cried for weeks. Their voices built one after another, filling the courtroom with years of buried pain. They spoke of threats, of humiliation, of money stolen from them under the guise of rules. The walls that once echoed only Karen's voice now echoed their defiance. Karen screamed above them, her voice breaking. Ungrateful. All of you. You'd be nothing without me. I kept you in order. I kept this place alive. But her words fell flat against the tide of truth rising from the benches. Finally, the man rose. He walked slowly to the stand, his step steady, his calm eyes sweeping the crowd. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried like thunder. For years, she made you believe you lived by her mercy. She built her power on fear. But fear is brittle. Tonight you've spoken the truth. And truth does not bow. He paused, his eyes steady on Karen. The land is not hers. It never was. The courtroom erupted in cheers, neighbors clapping and shouting, their voices shaking the walls. The judge struck the gavel again, demanding order, but even he could not hide the faint respect in his eyes as he looked at the man. This court will review all evidence and reconvene tomorrow morning for final judgment. The gavel struck one last time, sealing the day. The people poured out of the courthouse not in silence but in unity, their voices rising like a song. Lanterns glowed outside, lifted high in the bright afternoon sun. No more fear, they shouted. No more fear. Their chant echoed across the valley, a sound Karen could not silence. She slipped out a side door, her papers clutched in trembling hands, her shadow shrinking with every step. And the man stepped into the sunlight, his family at his side, the leather folder tucked under his arm, his calm eyes steady as ever. The valley looked at him not as a quiet neighbor, but as the one who had carried truth when they had only known fear. The courthouse was crowded even earlier the next morning, neighbors spilling into the hallways and down the steps outside. Word of the hearing had spread beyond the valley. Even strangers came to watch, curious about the story of an HOA president whose power was crumbling. Reporters swarmed the entrance, their cameras flashing as people filed in, their voices buzzing like a hive. Inside, the atmosphere was electric, heavy with expectation. The man sat quietly at his table, the leather folder placed neatly before him. His wife sat close, her hand resting lightly on his arm, her face calm but resolute. He did not look nervous, nor did he look proud. He simply looked ready. Karen entered moments later, her stride sharp but less steady than before. She wore her red jacket again, as if clinging to it like a crown, though her eyes betrayed her exhaustion. Dark circles framed her face, and her smile was thin, almost desperate. Behind her, her lawyer carried another thick stack of papers. His jaw tight, his expression uneasy. She slammed the papers onto the table with a loud thud, scanning the room for signs of fear, but she saw only cold stares. The neighbors no longer lowered their eyes. They looked directly at her now, their fear gone, replaced with something she had never seen before, anger. The judge entered and silence fell instantly. He struck the gavel once. This court resumes. I expect order, and I expect truth. His eyes landed briefly on Karen, sharp enough to make her grip her papers tighter. He nodded to her lawyer. Proceed. Karen's lawyer rose, clearing his throat loudly. Your Honor, we bring forward new evidence. Reports filed by certified inspectors proving that the cabin and pool are unsafe, that the land is unfit for private use, and that the defendant's so-called ownership endangers the community. He lifted the stack of papers high, his voice booming as he set them on the judge's bench. These documents prove this man is not only a fraud but a threat to public safety. Gasps spread through the benches. Neighbors leaned forward, whispering quickly. Some exchanged worried glances, fear tugging at them again. Karen smiled faintly, her confidence flickering back. She whispered to her lawyer, "This will bury him. Watch." But the Attorney General rose calmly, his tall figure casting a long shadow across the room. His voice was steady, unshaken. Your Honor, we demand verification. These documents appeared overnight. The community saw no inspectors, and I question their authenticity. His words stirred the benches into louder murmurs, voices rising with suspicion. The judge raised an eyebrow, flipping through the new reports. His brow furrowed. The signatures looked sloppy, the dates suspiciously fresh. He looked up sharply. Who authorized these inspections? Karen stood quickly, forcing a smile. The county responded to concerns, she said, her voice rushed. But her explanation rang hollow, and the neighbors knew it. A woman from the benches rose suddenly, her voice trembling but strong. No inspector came to my house. No one knocked on any door. She's lying. Another man stood, shouting across the room, we would have seen them. No inspector was here. Their voices spread, joined by others, until the courtroom buzzed with anger. The judge struck the gavel hard. Order, he barked. He turned his eyes back to Karen, his voice cold. If these documents are false, you will face charges for attempting to deceive this court. Do you understand? Karen froze, her hands shaking, her face pale beneath the harsh light. She forced a nod, though her voice broke. Why yes, Your Honor. The man rose then, slowly, his calm presence drawing every eye. He did not look at Karen. He looked at the neighbors, his voice soft but clear. You see it now. Every time the truth rises, she hides it beneath lies. Every time you find courage, she tries to bury it in fear. But fear cannot erase what is written in truth. His words sank deep into the crowd, and the neighbors began to nod, whispering to one another, louder and bolder than before. Karen slammed her fist on the table, her voice shrill. He's deceiving you. Without me, there will be chaos. Without me, you'll destroy yourselves. She turned wildly toward the crowd, her eyes desperate. Tell them. Tell the court you need me. But the crowd didn't answer. One by one, neighbors rose to their feet, their silence louder than her screams. Then, slowly, the chant began. No more fear. No more fear. The sound grew louder, spreading through the courtroom until it drowned her voice completely. The judge struck the gavel again, calling for silence, but even he did not scold the crowd. He leaned forward, his tone icy. This court will verify every page of these so-called reports. But let it be known, attempts to twist the truth will not protect you. His gaze cut into Karen until she finally dropped her eyes to the table. The hearing closed for the day, but the people left the courthouse not in silence, not in fear, but in unity. Their chant spilled into the streets, reporters capturing every word, every lantern raised high. No more fear, they cried, their voices echoing off the hills. Karen hurried out the side door, clutching her papers like broken shields, her lawyer trailing behind with his head low. Outside, the man stood with his family, surrounded by neighbors who clapped his back and thanked him, their faces glowing with something they hadn't felt in years, freedom. He spoke only once, his voice calm and steady, carrying over the crowd. Fear has shouted for too long. Tomorrow, the truth will speak louder. The neighbors cheered, raising their lanterns higher, their flames burning against the night. And in that glow, it was clear, Karen's grip had cracked, and the valley would never bow to her again. The next morning, the courthouse was filled to the brim, not a single seat empty. People stood along the walls, and more crowded outside with lanterns glowing even in daylight, their light a symbol of unity. The air inside was tight with expectation. Everyone knew today could be the day everything ended for Karen. The man sat quietly with his wife at his side, the leather folder resting in front of him like a silent shield. His children waited with neighbors in the back row, their innocent faces watching with wide eyes, too young to understand everything but old enough to sense its importance. When Karen entered, her stride was slower than before. The red jacket she wore so proudly now hung heavy on her shoulders. Her lawyer followed close behind, his face grim, his stack of papers smaller than the day before. Karen lifted her chin high, trying to mask her fear, but her eyes darted nervously across the benches. Where once she commanded lowered gazes, Now she met cold, defiant stares. The neighbors no longer feared her. They were waiting for her to fall. The judge entered, his robe flowing, his gavel striking loudly. The sound silenced the courtroom instantly. His stern gaze swept across the room, resting on Karen, then on the man. "This court resumes," he said firmly. "And today, we address the false inspection reports presented yesterday." His tone was sharp, leaving no room for excuses. The Attorney General rose, his tall figure casting a long shadow across the floor. His voice was steady, powerful. "Your Honor, we submitted those reports to the county for verification. Every signature, every seal, every line has been examined. And the truth is simple. They are forgeries. These documents are fake." He slammed the stack of forged reports on the bench, the sound cracking through the chamber. This was an attempt to deceive not only the neighbors, not only this man, but this court itself. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Neighbors leaned forward, their faces burning with anger. The judge's expression darkened as he turned toward Karen. Do you understand the seriousness of this?" he asked, his voice low but deadly. Karen sprang to her feet, her hands trembling as she slammed her palms on the table. "They are not fake," she shouted. "You don't understand. He's the liar. He's the one tricking all of you. Without me, this valley will fall apart." Her voice cracked, echoing desperately against the walls. The judge struck his gavel sharply. "Enough." His voice cut her down mid-sentence. "This court will not tolerate lies. You have already lost credibility by presenting false evidence. Another attempt, and you will face charges yourself." Karen froze, her face pale, her hands clutching the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles turned white. For the first time, she did not look like a ruler but like a cornered animal. The man stood then, slow and deliberate, his calm presence filling the room. He walked to the center, his eyes sweeping across the crowd. His voice was quiet, but it carried into every corner. "For years, she built her power on lies. She fined you for flowers. She fined you for shutters. She destroyed your gardens, your children's playthings, your joy. And when the truth rose, she buried it under more lies. But lies cannot last forever. They crumble. And today, you see them crumble." His words sank into every heart, and the neighbors rose slowly to their feet, one after another. An old man spoke from the benches, his voice trembling but strong. "She fined me 3 times for painting my shutters. I paid, but it was never enough." A mother followed, tears on her cheeks. "She called my roses weeds and tore them out." A father stood, his hand on his son's shoulder. "She destroyed his swing set." He cried for weeks. Their voices layered over one another until the courtroom echoed with years of hidden pain, spilling out all at once. Karen shouted above them, her voice shrill and desperate. "Lies! You're all lying. You ungrateful fools. Without me, this place would collapse. You'd drown in filth and disorder." But her words only fueled their courage. The neighbors stood taller, their voices rising louder. "No more fear," someone shouted. "No more lies," another cried. Soon the whole courtroom roared with chants, shaking the very walls. "No more fear. No more lies. No more fear." The judge struck his gavel hard, calling for order, but even he did not hide the flicker of respect in his eyes as he looked at the man who had turned silence into strength. "This court will reconvene tomorrow for final judgment," the judge declared firmly. "Until then, let it be known, the truth is stronger than fear." The gavel fell with a final crack. As the people poured out of the courthouse, they carried their chants into the streets. Reporters captured the moment, cameras flashing, microphones recording the roar of freedom rising from the valley. Lanterns were raised high even in daylight, their flames dancing against the sun. Karen was led out through a side door by her lawyer, her head down, her papers clutched like ashes. No one followed her. No one listened. She was no longer their ruler. She was nothing but a shadow. The man walked out into the sunlight, his wife at his side, his neighbors surrounding him. They clapped his shoulders, shook his hands, thanked him through tears. He said little, only one sentence as he raised his calm eyes to the glowing lanterns. Tomorrow, truth will finish what fear began. His voice carried across the crowd, and the people cheered, their voices rolling over the valley like thunder. That night, the valley glowed brighter than ever. Lanterns lined every path, every porch, every dock. Families feasted together, music played, laughter echoed across the lake. The children splashed in the pool without fear, their joy brighter than the lanterns themselves. And in the quiet cabin by the water, the man sat with his family, the leather folder resting on the table, his calm eyes reflecting the glow outside. His wife leaned against him and whispered, "Tomorrow ends it all." He nodded slowly. "No," he said softly. "Tomorrow begins it." The courthouse was overflowing on the morning of the 7th hearing, the benches packed so tightly that people stood shoulder to shoulder along the walls, while dozens more crowded outside, pressing their faces to the windows. Reporters had come in larger numbers now, their cameras flashing, their microphones poised to capture every word. The air was thick with anticipation, as if everyone knew the battle was reaching its breaking point. Inside, the neighbors whispered to one another, but it was not the whispers of fear they once shared. It was the murmurs of a people ready to see justice at last. Karen entered with her lawyer, but her stride had lost its strength. The red jacket that once served as her crown now seemed to weigh on her shoulders. Her eyes darted nervously across the room, and she found no lowered gazes, no trembling faces. Instead, she saw hard stares and clenched jaws. The neighbors she once ruled now looked at her as though she were already defeated. Still, she lifted her chin and forced a smile, though it twitched at the corners. Her lawyer carried fewer papers this time, and his expression revealed doubt he could no longer hide. The man entered next, his presence calm, steady. His wife walked beside him, her hand on his arm, while their children were seated in the back row with neighbors who had become protectors. The leather folder rested under his arm, not waved like a weapon but carried like a truth too strong to bend. The neighbors leaned forward when he passed, nodding, whispering encouragement, their faith in him unshaken. The judge entered, and silence fell instantly. His gavel struck, echoing like thunder across the chamber. "This court resumes," he declared. His eyes swept the room, lingering on Karen, then the man, before fixing on the packed benches. "Today, we address testimony. This court will hear directly from the community." Karen's lawyer rose quickly, his voice too loud, as if he were trying to drown out the weight of truth that already filled the air. He repeated the same arguments: order, safety, discipline. He waved the bylaws again, pages that seemed weaker than ever. "Without the HOA," he said, "there will be chaos. Without its president, this valley will collapse into disorder. You cannot let one man's papers outweigh the good of an entire community." Karen nodded furiously, her smile twitching wider, her hands gripping the table until her knuckles whitened. The judge turned to the benches. "The court will now hear from the residents." His voice was firm. "Step forward." An elderly man with a cane rose first. His hands shook, but his voice carried clearly. "She fined me for my shutters, Your Honor. 3 times. Each time I painted them exactly as she demanded, but she still said they were wrong. I spent my savings, but it was never enough." Gasps and nods spread through the room. Next, a young mother stood, her eyes wet with tears. "She tore out my roses," she said softly. "They were from my grandmother's home, planted with love. She said they were weeds. She humiliated me in front of my neighbors." Her voice cracked, but the people around her murmured comfort, some clapping quietly in support. A father stood next, his arm around his young son. "She destroyed his swing set," he said, his voice trembling with anger. "Said it wasn't approved. My boy cried every night for weeks, asking why he wasn't allowed to play in his own yard." The boy lowered his head, and the courtroom grew heavy with silence. Voices rose one after another. A man spoke of unfair fines for his fence. A woman described being called lazy in front of her children because her grass grew too tall when her husband was ill. An elderly widow described having her mailbox torn out because it didn't match community standards. Their words filled the chamber, years of hidden pain spilling into the light at last. Karen jumped to her feet, her face red, her voice shrill. Lies! All of you! You're twisting the truth. You're ungrateful. Without me, you'd have nothing. Without me, this place would collapse into filth. She turned wildly toward the crowd. Tell them you need me. Tell them you can't live without me. But no one answered. Dozens of eyes glared back, cold and unwavering. The man rose then, walking slowly to the center of the room. The noise died instantly, all eyes turning to him. He did not raise his arms, did not shout. He simply looked at the neighbors, then at the judge, and finally at Karen. His voice was quiet, but it carried into every corner. You have heard her voice for years. You have lived under her rules, her fines, her threats. And you have bowed your heads, believing you had no choice. But tonight, you lifted them. Tonight, you spoke. The truth is stronger than fear. And truth does not bow. The neighbors rose to their feet as one, clapping, cheering, their voices thundering louder than Karen's screams. No more fear. No more fear, they chanted, their lanterns lifted high even in the bright courtroom. The judge struck his gavel hard, calling for order, but his face softened, respect flickering in his eyes as he watched the people stand united. Karen's face twisted, her hands trembling as she screamed above the noise. You fools! You'll regret this. Without me, you'll fall apart. But her voice was swallowed by the chant, drowned by the sound of freedom that had been silent for too long. The judge struck the gavel one final time. This court will reconvene tomorrow morning for final judgment. His voice rang sharp. And it will be final. The people poured out of the courthouse chanting, their lanterns burning like fire, their voices shaking the valley. Reporters followed, their cameras capturing the moment the community stood together, fearless. Karen slipped out through a side door, her papers clutched like ashes, her lawyer trailing behind in silence. The man stepped into the sunlight, his wife and children at his side, neighbors surrounding him with cheers and gratitude. He spoke only once, his voice calm, steady, and unshaken. Tomorrow, the last chain breaks. And the valley roared with approval, their voices carrying across the lake, stronger than fear had ever been. That night, the valley did not sleep. Lanterns glowed in every window, lining porches, paths, and docks like stars pulled down from the sky. Families sat together outside, voices carrying across the lake. Where once there had been fear and silence, there was laughter, hope, and determination. People told their stories openly now, no longer whispering. An old man spoke of fines he had hidden for years, ashamed to admit he could not keep up. A young mother told neighbors how Karen once threatened her with eviction over a toy left on her lawn. Each confession was met with nods, sympathy, and promises that such days were finished. The valley felt alive, more alive than it had in decades. At the cabin, the man sat quietly on the porch with his wife, the leather folder resting on the table between them. The glow of lanterns reflected in the lake, shimmering like fire across the water. His wife leaned closer, her voice soft but steady. Tomorrow it ends, she whispered. He shook his head slowly, his calm eyes on the flickering light. No, he said. Tomorrow it begins. Fear has ruled for too long, but fear cannot live where truth stands. Their children slept peacefully inside, unaware of the storm that would finally break at dawn. At the clubhouse, Karen sat alone in her office. The once grand building was silent, its halls dark. Her lawyer had left earlier, his voice heavy with doubt, warning her to prepare for defeat. But Karen refused to hear it. She paced the floor, clutching her remaining papers, muttering to herself. They need me. They've always needed me. Without me, they'll fall apart. She caught sight of her reflection in the dark glass of the window, her hair undone, her jacket wrinkled, her eyes wild. For the first time, she did not see power. She saw fear. She turned away sharply, whispering through clenched teeth, "They'll see tomorrow. I'll make them see." By dawn, The courthouse steps were already crowded. Neighbors arrived in groups, carrying lanterns they refused to extinguish, holding them high even against the rising sun. Reporters swarmed the scene, their cameras flashing, their voices buzzing with questions. Will this be the final day? Does the HOA still hold power? But the neighbors answered louder than the reporters. No more fear, they shouted. Their chant echoed across the hills, a sound of defiance that refused to be silenced. The man arrived quietly, walking with his wife at his side, the leather folder under his arm. The crowd parted for him instinctively, their voices softening as he passed. Some reached out to touch his shoulder, others bowed their heads in thanks, and still others raised their lanterns higher, letting the flames glow brighter. His calm presence steadied them. He did not give a speech, but his silence carried more than words ever could. Karen arrived minutes later, stepping out of her car with her chin high and her red jacket fastened tight. But the reaction was not the same. No one cheered. No one bowed. Instead, the crowd turned cold, their eyes cutting into her like knives. Some crossed their arms, others muttered under their breath, and many simply turned their backs. She marched quickly up the steps, clutching her papers, her lawyer trailing behind like a shadow. For the first time, she walked not through obedience, but through rejection. Inside, the courtroom was packed tighter than ever. The judge entered and struck his gavel sharply, silencing the hum of voices. His eyes swept over the room, stern and unyielding. This court will deliver its ruling today, he said. But before judgment, both sides will speak one final time. Karen's lawyer rose first, his voice weaker than before. He repeated old arguments, waving the bylaws again, clinging to the rules that no longer held power. He spoke of safety, of order, of chaos without the HOA. But his words fell flat. The neighbors no longer shifted nervously. They stared at him with cold disbelief, their minds already made up. Karen whispered harshly in his ear, urging him on, but the more he spoke, the more hollow it sounded. Then the Attorney General rose. His voice was calm but strong, filling the chamber. He lifted the leather folder and placed it before the judge. This is the truth, he said. It is not noise. It is not fear. These deeds are valid, binding, and older than the HOA itself. They prove the land was never hers, never the board's, but belongs to this man and his family. Fear ruled this valley for years, but today, truth stands in its place. He closed the folder with finality, his eyes sweeping the room. Let the court remember, fear fades. Truth remains. The judge nodded slowly, his expression heavy with the weight of the decision to come. Tomorrow morning, he declared, his gavel striking once, this court will deliver its final judgment. The room erupted, not with fear, but with chants. No more fear. No more fear. Lanterns were lifted high, their flames flickering even in the bright daylight spilling through the windows. The sound shook the walls, rolling into the streets outside, where the crowd outside picked it up and roared it louder. Karen tried to shout over them, her voice shrill. You fools! Without me, you'll collapse. Without me, this place will fall apart. But her words were drowned by the chant, swallowed by the roar of unity that had risen from the very people she once ruled. She sank back into her chair, her papers trembling in her hands, her crown of fear shattered. The man stood slowly, his calm presence cutting through the noise without force. The crowd fell silent as he spoke. Tomorrow, fear ends. Tomorrow, truth begins. His voice was steady, certain, and the neighbors cheered until the walls shook. That night, the valley glowed brighter than ever before. Lanterns lined every path, every dock, every porch, burning against the darkness. Families gathered together, singing, laughing, celebrating not a verdict yet delivered, but a freedom they already felt in their bones. And in the cabin by the lake, the man sat quietly with his wife, the leather folder resting between them. She whispered softly, "It will be over tomorrow." He shook his head gently, his calm eyes on the glowing horizon. "No," he said. "It will finally begin." The courthouse was overflowing on the morning of the judgment. the steps crowded with neighbors carrying lanterns that glowed even in the bright sun. Reporters swarmed the street, microphones raised, cameras flashing, their voices buzzing with urgency. Inside, the benches were so packed that people stood in the aisles, pressed against the walls, their faces tight with anticipation. The air felt heavy, as though the walls themselves were waiting for the gavel to fall. The man sat quietly at the front, his wife at his side, the leather folder resting calmly on the table. He didn't fidget, didn't glance nervously around. His calm eyes remained fixed forward, steady as stone. Karen entered moments later, her stride sharp but unsteady. The red jacket she clung to like a symbol of power now seemed to drag her down. Her smile flickered weakly, failing to reach her eyes. The neighbors did not bow their heads this time. They watched her walk past with cold stares, some even turning away deliberately. She tried to hold her chin high, but the weight of their rejection pressed heavily against her. Her lawyer followed, carrying a smaller pile of papers than before, his expression grim, his faith in her clearly gone. The judge entered, and silence swept the room like a wave. His gavel struck, the sound echoing like thunder. This court will now deliver its judgment. His words were firm, final. The room seemed to freeze, every breath held in anticipation. He began slowly, his voice steady. This community has lived under the rules of the Homeowners Association for years. Rules can serve to guide and protect, but rules can also be twisted into tools of control and fear. Over these past days, we have heard testimony of fines that punished rather than guided, threats that silenced rather than protected, and lies that sought to bury the truth. His gaze shifted toward Karen, sharp as a blade. She lowered her eyes to the table, her knuckles white as she gripped her papers. The judge continued, lifting the leather folder. We have also reviewed deeds and records that prove, beyond any doubt, that the land in question, the pool, the cabin, and the surrounding property, were never under HOA authority. These documents are valid, binding, and older than the HOA itself. The truth is clear. This land belongs not to the board, not to the president, but to this man and his family. Gasps filled the room, followed quickly by cries of joy. Neighbors clutched one another, some weeping, others cheering. Karen shot to her feet, her face red with fury. No! This can't be. I built this community. I made it what it is. You can't take it from me. Her voice cracked, shrill and desperate, echoing against walls that no longer answered her. The judge struck his gavel sharply. Silence. This court finds that the HOA president abused her power, deceived this community, and attempted to deceive this court. Effective immediately, the HOA is dissolved. This valley is free. The gavel struck one last time, heavy and final. The room erupted into cheers. Neighbors rose to their feet, clapping, shouting, their voices merging into one deafening roar. No more fear. No more fear. The chant shook the walls, spilled through the doors, and echoed into the streets outside. Reporters rushed forward, cameras flashing, capturing the moment of victory. Karen screamed above the noise, her voice breaking. You fools! You'll regret this. Without me, you'll destroy yourselves. You need me. But her words were drowned by the roar of freedom. Two officers stepped forward, gently but firmly guiding her toward the door. Her papers spilled from her trembling hands, scattering across the floor like ashes. No one bent to pick them up. The neighbors turned their backs as she passed, refusing to give her even a final glance. For the first time in years, she walked not as a ruler but as nothing. A woman stripped of power, her reign ended. The man rose slowly, his calm presence cutting through the chaos. The crowd fell silent, turning to him instinctively. He stepped forward, his voice quiet but carrying like thunder. For years you lived under fear. You bowed your heads, believing you had no power. But today you stood. Today you spoke. And today, you are free. His words washed over them, and the crowd erupted again, cheering louder than before. Outside, the courthouse steps became a celebration. Lanterns were raised high, glowing even in daylight, their flames dancing like stars. Families hugged, children laughed, and neighbors who had once feared speaking now shouted boldly. Reporters shouted questions, but the neighbors answered first. "We are free," they said. "No more fear." The man stepped into the sunlight with his wife and children, surrounded by neighbors who clapped his back, shook his hands, and thanked him through tears. He did not smile proudly, nor boast of victory. He only looked out over the glowing lanterns and said softly, "The valley was never hers. It was always yours." And the crowd roared with approval, their voices carrying across the lake, across the hills, across the very land that now belonged to them again. That night, after the gavel had fallen and the courthouse emptied, the valley came alive in a way no one had seen for decades. Lanterns glowed on every porch, lining the paths like rivers of fire. The lake shimmered under the reflection of hundreds of lights, as if the stars themselves had come down to celebrate. Families spilled into the open air, bringing food, music, and stories. Where silence and fear once ruled, laughter rang out, echoing across the hills. Children ran barefoot in the grass, their shouts of joy carrying through the night. Parents who once kept their voices low now sang and clapped freely, their eyes wet with relief. For the first time in years, the valley was whole. The man sat quietly on his porch, his wife beside him, their children curled against a blanket nearby, exhausted from the day's excitement but smiling even in their sleep. The leather folder lay on the table, closed now, no longer needed as a weapon. His wife traced its edges with her fingers, her voice soft. "It's over," she whispered. He shook his head gently, his calm eyes reflecting the glow of lanterns on the water. "No," he said. "It's just beginning." Neighbors began to gather outside the cabin, carrying baskets of food, trays of bread, and jugs of cider. Someone brought a fiddle, another a drum, and soon music filled the night air. The once quiet clearing became a festival. People danced barefoot, children splashed in the shallow edge of the lake, and voices rose in songs of freedom. The old man with the cane lifted his lantern high and declared, "For years we bent under fear. Tonight, we stand free." The crowd erupted in cheers, the chant beginning again, "No more fear, no more fear." Their voices thundered into the hills, drowning out the memory of Karen's reign. Far away, Karen sat alone in her darkened house, her papers scattered across the floor like fallen leaves. The jacket she once wore like a crown hung limp over the back of a chair. She clutched her head in her hands, the echoes of the chant still ringing in her ears. For the first time, she felt what her neighbors had lived with for years. Not power, not control, but fear. She was no longer the queen of the valley. She was a shadow, forgotten, her power broken forever. Back at the lake, the celebration stretched long into the night. Families who had not spoken in years sat side by side, sharing food and laughter. Mothers held their children close, fathers clasped hands with neighbors, and the community that had once lived in silence now roared with life. The man walked among them quietly, listening to their stories, accepting their thanks with a nod, never boasting, never raising his voice. His calm presence was enough. When he spoke, his words were simple. The land was never hers. It was always yours. Guard it well. As the night deepened, the music slowed, and families returned to their homes, lanterns still glowing bright in the windows. The pool, once a place of fear, was now alive with children's laughter again. Their splashes echoed through the valley, a sound no one would ever silence again. The man returned to his porch, his wife resting her head against his shoulder. Together, they watched the last lanterns flicker against the lake. She whispered, "Do you think they'll remember this night?" He nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, "because tonight, they learned that truth is stronger than fear. And truth does not fade." Dawn broke quietly, the sky painted in gold and silver. The lanterns had burned low, but their memory lingered in every heart. Children woke early, eager to play, their laughter filling the air. Parents stepped out of their homes without dread, their shoulders lighter, their smiles brighter. The valley had changed, and it would never return to silence again. The man stood on his porch, his children racing past him, his wife smiling at their joy. The leather folder still rested on the table, but it was no longer a shield. It was a reminder of what had been fought for and won. He took a deep breath of the crisp morning air, his calm eyes on the rising sun, and whispered, "The valley is free." And across the lake, through every porch and every home, the truth of his words shone brighter than the dawn. Fear had ended. A new beginning had come.